Vet finds dying dog in the snow. Days later, he does something no one can explain. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always awesome to see how far our stories are reaching. The wind cut like icy knives across her face. The sky, heavy with thick clouds, seemed to swallow every trace of light. In the white silence of the western mountains, Dr. Sarah Bennett, wrapped in her thermal coat, fought her way through fresh snow. Far off, a piercing howl stopped her in her tracks. It wasn't the cry of a wild wolf or a lost coyote. It was something else, something full of pain. Sarah, a veterinarian specializing in wildlife and a native of Mountain Town, had answered an urgent call. An unexpected avalanche had buried part of the trail to the animal shelter she managed. She didn't expect to find life among the frozen debris, but something in her gut told her not to leave yet. She pushed through half-fallen trees and cracked ice until she saw it. A German shepherd, its black fur matted with mud, bleeding heavily from one back leg. The dog lay half-buried, its body curled forward as if shielding something. Beside it, shivering with cold, a girl no older than 6, her cheeks purple and lips chapped by the wind, clung to its neck. "My God," Sarah whispered, dropping to her knees. The dog, still conscious, didn't growl or show fear. Its deep amber eyes locked onto Sarah's, as if it had known her forever. Around its neck hung a worn ID tag, barely readable, with one word faintly visible: guide. Sarah's adrenaline surged as she radioed for rescuers, wrapping the girl in a thermal blanket. The dog never stopped watching her. It didn't whimper or complain. Its gaze didn't ask for help. It demanded it. Hours later, in her makeshift clinic, an old cabin turned medical station, Sarah faced one of the toughest calls of her career. The dog had multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and severe hypothermia. Every protocol pointed to one thing: euthanasia. But as her hand reached for the syringe, something stopped her. "No, you didn't come this far to die," she whispered, touching the dog's muzzle. She decided to name the dog Shadow, not for its dark fur, but for the shadow that had cloaked its life before they met. Shadow hadn't just protected the girl, it had saved her, shielding her with its own body during the avalanche. That loyalty, that instinct to give its life for another, deserved a second chance. Sarah worked day and night, giving medicine, performing small surgeries, praying to science and to something more. What followed was a miracle that even she, with her training and deep-rooted skepticism, couldn't fully explain. The silence in the cabin felt almost sacred. The early hours crept by slowly, as if time itself refused to disturb the fragile balance between life and death. Shadow lay on a makeshift stretcher, covered with thermal blankets, while basic monitors recorded his weak but steady pulse. The flickering light of an oil lamp cast dancing shadows on the wooden walls, as if unseen presences watched from the corners. Sarah hadn't left his side in 3 days. Dark circles marked her face, and her hands trembled as she checked the stitches. She hadn't slept or eaten properly. She was consumed by the recovery of a creature that, against all odds, refused to give up. On the second night, something strange happened. While Sarah reviewed vital signs, a warm current filled the room. The temperature, which had been freezing until then, seemed to rise suddenly. Shadow, who had been still for hours, slowly turned his head and fixed his gaze on her. It wasn't a reflex. It wasn't chance. Sarah froze. For a moment she felt something, or someone else looking at her through those amber eyes. It was as if an image flashed through her mind. A meadow at sunset, a man walking with a white cane, and Shadow guiding him. She pressed a hand to her forehead, thinking it was exhaustion, but the feeling didn't fade. It grew stronger with each passing hour. "What are you?" Sarah murmured, stroking the dog's forehead. Against all predictions, Shadow began to improve. First, his heartbeat stabilized. Then the internal bleeding stopped, even though the planned surgery hadn't been fully completed. By the 5th day, he stood briefly, awkwardly supporting a leg that had been useless before. Sarah, stunned, watched as the dog limped toward the cabin door, as if he knew the world outside was calling him. Curious, Sarah dug deeper into his origins. On the small tag, she managed to restore part of the engraving. She learned he had come from an experimental training center in a northern state. There were no clear public records, just vague mentions in specialized forums and old articles. She sent a confidential request to a colleague in a nearby city, an expert in animal neurocognition. While waiting for a reply, something even stranger happened. Shadow didn't just regain mobility, he seemed to sense emotions with eerie precision. One night, as Sarah cried quietly, remembering her late sister, Shadow approached, rested his head on her lap, and let out a soft, almost human whimper. Sarah hadn't told anyone about her sister, never spoke of her, yet somehow this dog knew. The feeling of facing something beyond logic grew daily. He wasn't just a dog, he was a presence, a guide, a connection to something greater. In a stylish but gloomy apartment in downtown Pinewood, the keys of a Steinway piano sat covered in a thin layer of dust. The curtains stayed closed day and night, blocking out the sun, as if the owner had chosen to shut out the world entirely. There lived Michael Carter, a piano prodigy who at 33 had dazzled audiences from Vienna to New York, until one rainy night, a sharp curve and a split second stole the light and the music from his life. The accident had taken more than his sight. It had robbed him of his essence. Since then, Michael lived in literal and emotional darkness, avoiding visitors, dismissing therapy, and rejecting any attempt to adapt. He refused a cane or screen reader. The piano keys, once his sanctuary, felt foreign, indifferent. His sister, Emily Carter, a well-known art curator in a nearby city, was worried about his state and sought alternative solutions. She'd heard of a special dog, one said to have an uncommon sensitivity. Without telling him, she arranged a meeting with Dr. Sarah Bennett, whose reputation was quietly spreading. Sarah arrived with Shadow in the back of her old Jeep, knowing she'd face resistance. Emily greeted her with a whisper. "He's not expecting visitors or animals." "Don't worry, Shadow isn't an ordinary animal," Sarah replied. They climbed the carpeted stairs to the study, where Michael sat listening to a Bach recording. He didn't move when he heard footsteps. He only spoke. "I don't want therapy or pity. If you're here to convince me of something, you can leave." Shadow didn't wait for instructions. He stepped forward, silent but steady, and sat in front of Michael, who frowned, sensing the air shift slightly. "What's that?" he asked, uneasy. "His name is Shadow," Sarah said. "He's not here to convince you. He's here to listen." Michael scoffed, but before he could say another word, he felt a warm pressure on his knee. Shadow had placed his paw there with almost telepathic precision. Michael tensed. The silence grew heavy. Then, something stirred inside him. A faint but vivid image crossed his mind. A concert hall in Chicago, with him under a spotlight playing the third movement of Rachmaninoff. He could no longer see, but somehow, he had just seen. Sarah, watching from the doorway, shivered. She'd seen it before. Shadow didn't communicate with barks, but with mental impressions, like whispers from the soul. "What did this dog do to me?" Michael whispered, trembling. "Nothing. He just showed you what you still carry inside," Sarah said softly. Over the next few days, Michael, reluctantly, allowed Shadow to stay. He didn't talk to Sarah, but he didn't send her away either. Shadow began sleeping by his bed, following him around the apartment, guiding him with an almost choreographed grace. Every obstacle, every corner was anticipated with subtle, precise movements. No leash was needed, no commands were given. It was as if Shadow knew every inch of the place before entering. One night, while Emily slept on the couch and Sarah reviewed notes in her journal, Michael sat at the piano. He didn't know why. Shadow lay beside him, silent. Michael reached out and for the first time in months played a single note, then another, and then a full melody, flowing from him like a river held back too long. It was new. He'd never written it before, but it poured out as if it had always been there, waiting to be set free. Shadow watched him, not with adoration, with recognition. The melody that flowed from Michael's hands that night wasn't just a composition, it was a bottled-up cry, a plea wrapped in harmony, a mirror of his broken soul. Sarah, from the hallway, held her breath. Emily, waking slowly, sat up with tears in her eyes. Neither dared interrupt the sacred moment. Shadow, lying by the piano, closed his eyes, as if he too were listening, not just to the sound, but to the truth behind each note. By dawn, the change was clear. Michael, who had rejected all help for months, asked Emily to bring him staff paper. He couldn't see, but he needed to capture what he felt. He dictated, phrase by phrase, as she scribbled with trembling fingers, as if afraid the fragile moment would vanish with the daylight. "This music doesn't come from me," Michael murmured, his voice shaking. "It's like someone's whispering it in my ear, like I can see through Shadow. Sarah approached, holding a mug of hot coffee. She studied him for a moment before speaking. Maybe you were never blind, Michael. Maybe you were just waiting for a new kind of sight. He didn't reply. He only stroked Shadow's head, who wagged his tail slightly. Shadow wasn't a pet. He was a presence, a kind of sentinel. Michael began a routine. With Shadow as his guide, he walked the quieter streets of the neighborhood, memorizing sounds, smells, textures. Sarah sometimes joined but stayed silent, letting the bond between man and dog grow on its own. One day, near a frozen river, Shadow stopped abruptly. Michael felt the tension in the symbolic leash and froze. The dog let out a low, guttural murmur. From the trees, a figure emerged, a tall man in a dark parka and sunglasses, watching them with undisguised interest. "Do you know him?" Michael asked, frowning. "No, but I don't like how he's looking at us," Sarah said, stepping instinctively toward him. The man gave a brief smile and then walked away without a word. Shadow tracked him with his eyes until he vanished into the woods. From that day, Sarah noticed a new restlessness in Shadow. At night, he stayed alert, ears up, eyes fixed on the window, as if waiting for something or someone. Sarah revisited the tag's information. The center in a northern state, the Vision Bridge project, was tied to discontinued Defense Department research from a decade ago. They trained guide dogs not just to assist physically, but to predict medical and emotional crises. What she didn't expect was a familiar name among the scientists: Dr. James Sullivan, a neurobiologist who vanished mysteriously 6 years ago, and who, according to leaked records, had been developing ways to share sensory experiences between humans and animals. "This isn't just a miracle," Sarah whispered at her computer screen. "Shadow is a key." That night, Michael had a strange dream. He saw a valley shrouded in blue mist, where a crowd walked silently, guided by animals with golden eyes. There, for a moment, he opened his eyes and saw, not just light, but shapes, colors, and a face he didn't know, the man from the river. He woke, gasping, with Shadow beside him, staring. "You saw it too, didn't you?" Michael asked quietly. The dog didn't answer, but he didn't need to. The days after the strange riverside encounter were marked by an uneasy silence. Michael resumed his walks with Shadow, but with a new awareness. Every rustle in the trees, every shadow at dusk, sparked a fresh, almost animal instinct in him. Sarah, meanwhile, dove into classified files and encrypted forums each night, piecing together fragments of a buried experiment. Then she found a forgotten coordinate, mentioned once in a redacted report, a mountainous region locals called Blue Mist Valley. According to old geological surveys, the area had magnetic anomalies and unusual piezoelectric mineral deposits, which could, in theory, affect sensory perception and neural electrical fields. Sarah couldn't ignore the coincidence. There, in that near-mythical place, Dr. Sullivan had set up the first sensory connection research outpost. There, according to the data she deciphered, the first litter of dogs with what the lab called cognitive hypersensitivity was born. "We have to go," Sarah said one night. "No nonsense. Michael, what you're experiencing, it's not random. That place might hold answers." Michael, facing the closed window, answered after a long pause, "I've been there. In dreams. I don't know how, but it felt real, like it was calling me." So they set out, with Shadow in the back of the Jeep and Emily, reluctant but supportive, driving steadily through endless curves and boundless forests. After 2 days, the landscape changed. The air grew thicker, the sky seemed to hang over them like a heavy dome, and a blue mist began to rise from the ground, rippling like an ancient whisper. As they entered the valley, Shadow reacted. He sat up, bristled, and let out a low, steady whine. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. They were walking through a land he knew deep in his genetic memory. The place wasn't entirely deserted. They found an old wooden structure, half buried in vines, with strange symbols carved on the walls, and a collapsed observation tower. Inside, in a room coated with dust and silence, they found documents, faded photos, and analog tape recordings. In one photo, Sarah recognized the man from the river, younger, in a lab coat. Beside him, a puppy with the same amber eyes as Shadow. "He was the first," Sarah murmured, "the first complete bond." As they played the tapes, a calm, firm male voice spoke through static. Sensory contact has evolved beyond our predictions. The dog doesn't just anticipate, it transmits. It can project memories, sensations, images, like a bridge. We've crossed an invisible line, but they're watching us. They're following. This must stay hidden until the bond can survive without us. That night, Michael slept outside the cabin with Shadow on a thick blanket. The blue mist drifted slowly among the trees. In that magical twilight, Michael dreamed again. But this time it wasn't a dream. He stood without a cane in a field of blue flowers. Beside him, a young boy with light hair held his hand. It was himself as a child. In the distance, a man watched with warmth before turning and fading into the mist. Shadow at his side stood still, as if guarding a revelation too sacred to interrupt. When Michael woke, he cried, not from sadness, from certainty. Something inside him had found peace. The first light of dawn barely pierced the thick mist cloaking the valley like an eternal veil. The abandoned cabin, now lit by flashlights and the faint glow of a portable generator, had become a living archive. The walls, once covered in mold and neglect, now revealed maps, handwritten equations, and neurosensory diagrams detailing connections between the brain's cortex and canine olfactory centers. Sarah sat at a makeshift table, poring over coded documents from a sealed metal box marked with symbols. She vaguely recognized as belonging to an old, secretive scientific group, the Silver Circle, a shadowy society tied to ethically questionable experiments during the Cold War. With each page, her expression hardened. "This wasn't just sensory training," she murmured. "It was an attempt to create a two-way emotional link between species, a permanent bond." Michael, still reeling from his vivid experience, approached quietly. Shadow stayed close, alert to every move, every word. Michael no longer needed to rest his hand on the dog's back. He walked naturally, as if his body trusted an inner compass that only activated near Shadow. Among the documents, Sarah found a newer recording dated just 2 years ago. A familiar, measured voice spoke confidentially. One subject survived. It shows sensitivity beyond all recorded metrics. It responds not just to the physical environment, but to the emotional states of nearby humans. It holds memories it didn't live, emotions that aren't its own. The Vision Bridge project continues in secret. Sullivan protected it, but others don't share his compassion. If this bond thrives, it could reshape our understanding of consciousness. Emily, pale, stepped back from the table. "Are you saying Shadow doesn't just feel what Michael feels, but can carry his memories, like an emotional mirror?" "Exactly," Sarah replied. "But it's not a passive mirror. He transforms what he receives, purifies it. That's why Michael has changed." Just then, a faint sound broke the tense air. Footsteps outside. Shadow stood instantly, muscles taut. Sarah switched off the flashlight. Michael stepped back instinctively. Through the cabin's cracks, they saw shapes moving among the trees. Not hikers, not curious locals. Men in tactical gear, no visible insignia. "They found us," Emily whispered, her voice cracking. Sarah opened a trapdoor in the cabin floor, a forgotten entrance to an old mining tunnel network skirting the valley. There was no time to argue. They grabbed essentials and descended. Shadow went last, but before vanishing, he turned toward the door as if saying goodbye, or sensing the fight was just beginning. Through the damp, dark tunnel, guided by the faint beam of a headlamp, Sarah mentally replayed every clue, every image, every word. The Vision Bridge project wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. Sullivan had guarded it, even at the cost of his disappearance. Now, someone else wanted to reclaim what they saw as government property. They emerged at the base of a rocky slope, overlooking the valley. Above, the armed figures searched silently, knowing they couldn't lose the dog. He wasn't just an animal. He was a biological key, a phenomenon, a threat to those who wanted to control human perception. "We have to protect him," Michael said firmly. "Not for me, not for us, for everyone who's ever lived in darkness and didn't know there was another way to see." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. The defeated man she'd met weeks ago was gone. In his place stood a leader, a witness, and Shadow, the guardian who had lit a spark in the dark. The cold on the slope turned biting, as if the valley itself reacted to the looming threat. The blue mist lingered, swirling around the feet of Sarah, Michael, Emily, and Shadow as they descended a narrow path lined with twisted trees. The silence was total, broken only by the crunch of dry branches underfoot and the faint echo of orders whispered by the armed men hunting them. Shadow moved with hypnotic confidence. He didn't run or stumble. He led the group with instinctual calm, as if he knew every inch of this ancient land. Sarah watched him with growing awe. His senses seemed tuned to a frequency they couldn't grasp. At every fork in the path he chose without hesitation. He was more than a guide. He was a beacon in the gloom. They reached a circular clearing ringed by rocks covered in glowing lichen. At the center, a stone formation like a natural altar, etched with ancient symbols none of them could read. Shadow climbed slowly to the center, sat, and raised his face to the sky where the mist parted just above him. A pale beam of light fell, illuminating him as if the universe itself leaned in. Michael dropped to his knees. Tears flowed, unstoppable. "This is it," he said, voice breaking. "This is where it all began." A deep vibration pulsed through the ground, not a tremor, but a low, sustained note that sank into their bones. Shadow stood, took a step forward, and let out a long, ancient howl as if from an extinct species. The response came swiftly. Howls rose from the mountains, some near, some far, like echoes of a dormant brotherhood waking at last. "He's not alone," Emily whispered, stunned. "He never was." Minutes later, 3 canine figures emerged from the woods. Each was distinct, one snow-white, another steel-gray, the third dappled with emerald eyes. Their movements were synchronized, almost ceremonial. They circled Shadow solemnly, sniffed briefly, then sat around him, forming an imperfect square. Sarah could barely breathe. These weren't mere animals. They were guardians, heirs of the same impossible lineage. They were living memory. From the forest's edge, the armed men watched in silence. One, visibly nervous, raised his rifle. The leader, a pale man with sunken eyes, stopped him with a gesture. "Don't shoot," he ordered, jaw tight. "Not yet." Sarah, sensing movement in the trees, raised her voice. "You have no right to take what you don't understand. He's not property or a failed experiment. He's a bridge between what we are and what we could be." The leader stepped forward. His face emerged from the shadows. Sarah recognized him instantly. "Dr. Sullivan," she said, throat tight. He wasn't an enemy. He was the creator. Yet his gaze wasn't that of a savior. It was that of a man who had paid dearly for crossing the boundaries of science. "We didn't come for him," Sullivan said softly. "We came for you." Those words, brief but heavy, landed like a verdict. Sarah stepped back. Michael moved in front of Shadow. Emily gripped a small knife from her pack, more a symbol of defiance than a real weapon. But Shadow stepped forward, eyes steady. He walked to Sullivan and stopped before him. Their gazes locked. The silence fell. Sullivan knelt slowly. His trembling fingers stroked the fur between Shadow's ears. "I still hear your echo, even in my dreams," he whispered. "Forgive me for what we did. We didn't know when to stop." Shadow didn't respond, but his stance softened. No resentment, only acceptance. Sullivan turned to the others. "The only way to save them is to make the world forget them for a while. If you keep going, they won't just hunt you, they'll destroy you." "Then fight with us," Michael said. "Use your knowledge to protect what you awakened." Sullivan hesitated. Then, with heavy slowness, he nodded. "There'll be consequences." "There always are," Sarah replied. "But you can't close a door once it's been opened." Shadow, hearing this, raised his head and let out another howl. This time, it wasn't a call. It was an answer. The air felt different, thicker, more aware. The blue mist had begun to pull back toward the treetops, as if honoring the silent pact just sealed between Shadow and his creator. The other 3 dogs, the guardians, melted into the woods without a sound. They didn't flee. They simply returned to their unseen place in the world's cracks. Sullivan, still kneeling, rested his hand on Shadow's back for a few seconds more. Then he stood with effort. The years weighed on him, not in his body but in his eyes, those of a man who had seen too much and carried more than any human soul could bear without breaking. "I can't promise protection," he said, gazing at the sacred circle with a mix of reverence and guilt. "But I can teach you to hide, to create a web of echoes instead of a single light. What you stand for must outlive me, outlive you." Sarah nodded gravely. Instinctively, she opened the notebook where she'd logged every observation about Shadow since day one. She began writing, not data, but instructions. A manifesto, a map for a new kind of bond between species, where understanding came not through words, but through presence and instinct. Michael, meanwhile, stood at the altar's edge, eyes closed, head tilted back. He breathed with a calm he'd never felt before. Though still blind, he sensed the air's texture, the energy of living things, the distant steps. He saw without eyes. He saw with his soul. That night, they took shelter in a cave hidden among obsidian rocks. Sullivan explained he'd set it up years ago as an emergency sanctuary. Camouflaged solar panels, supplies, water filtered by geothermal systems, and a record room holding all his research, physical and digital copies, beyond any traceable server's reach. The government wasn't the only one interested in the Vision Bridge project, Sullivan warned as he lit a portable lamp. Private investors, tech corporations, drug companies. Some wanted to replicate the bond in humans, others to profit from the dog's ability to predict emotions. Emily, sitting by a metal shelf, flipped through a sealed file marked with red tape. What happened to the other dogs in the program? Sullivan looked down. Not all survived the sensory overload. One in particular tried to protect its human during a military operation. Tell me in the comments, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate this story so far? Your opinion means a lot to me. It absorbed so much emotional trauma it collapsed, died without a single physical wound. A sharp silence settled in the cave. Shadow, lying beside Michael, lifted his head as if he understood every word. His eyes gleamed with a melancholy that didn't seem his own, as if he carried stories he'd never lived. Sarah closed her notebook. We'll rebuild. We'll form a quiet network, off the radar. An institute. Not for fame, but for those who've never had a voice. Michael approached, resting his hand on her shoulder. Call it New Dawn, because that's what I see now. New horizons, even in the dark. Sullivan nodded, almost imperceptibly. But do it right. Keep the balance. Shadow isn't a lab miracle. He's a piece of what nature hasn't fully revealed, and what's still hidden can turn on those who try to control it. The weeks that followed became a controlled exodus. Under Sullivan's guidance, the group quietly built a base that doubled as an operational hub. They used analog tech to avoid tracking, communicated via shortwave radio. Shadow began training a new generation of sensitive dogs, chosen not by breed, but by instinct. None were forced. They chose. Michael, now a composer reborn, wrote a series of pieces based on the sensations Shadow shared. Secret concerts spread, where music paired with sensory projections from trained volunteers, people living with the new dogs interpreting the psychic echoes they produced. The world outside kept turning, but beneath the world's skin, something new was growing. A silent movement, a network of guardians. Years later, under a sky silvered by the first snowfall of winter, a group gathered in a hidden clearing where once only blue mist dared to tread. No press, no speeches, just a circle of wooden chairs around a small stage carved from stone. There at the center, Michael Carter, older now with grey temples and absolute calm in his face, sat at a plain, upright piano, no paint or frills. Beside him, a dog with dark fur, now streaked with white at the muzzle, rested with his head on his paws. Shadow. The melody that rose was a farewell. A wordless hymn woven from the years they'd shared, two souls who'd learned to see through scars, who'd healed not by magic, but by devotion. Each note was a memory, each chord, a promise kept. At the back of the clearing, Sarah, now International Director of the New Dawn Institute, watched in silence. The project had grown quietly, like roots under soil. Smaller centers had sprouted in remote places, Iceland, northern Canada, the Scottish Highlands. All ran on the same principle: reciprocity, respect, time. Emily, now research coordinator, led a new generation of scholars, ethologists, therapists, neuroscientists, musicians. None wore lab coats. All lived among the dogs. Dr. Sullivan had passed 2 winters ago at peace under Sarah's care. Before he died, he left one request: that his story not be erased, but told carefully, as both warning and legacy. His name was etched not in marble, but in living wood at the first sanctuary, where nature could claim it back. The second-generation dogs now guided autistic children, seniors with Alzheimer's, war veterans. They didn't heal miraculously, but they taught how to feel again. They didn't follow commands, but understood moods with a gentleness no formula could capture. Shadow, the first, the original, no longer trained. He didn't need to. His mere presence was enough for the new dogs to know who they were and why they were there. Lately, he slept more. His steps were slow, but his gaze remained sharp, intense, ancient. As the music ended, Michael let his hands rest on the keys. The silence that followed was complete, as if the world held its breath for a moment. Shadow stood, walked to him, and rested his muzzle on his knee. Michael smiled. "Thanks, friend." Shadow turned slowly, walked to the center of the stone stage and looked at the sky. A ray of sun slipped through the clouds and touched his fur for a brief second. Then he lay down, closed his eyes, and didn't open them again. Michael didn't cry. Neither did Sarah. Emily did, but quietly, as if cleansing her soul with gratitude. Shadow left as he'd lived, without noise, without fear, knowing it wasn't the end. Because in every dog that followed, in every silent bond forged, he lived on. Between worlds, between senses, between beings who'd learned to see in the dark. Thank you so much for sticking with this story until the end. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us a ton and motivates us to keep bringing new stories every week. And since you're here, take a moment to check out another one of our stories that's popping up on your screen. Big hug and see you next time. Stay well.